The work does not ask how you feel today. It waits. The room is cold. The floor presses through thin fabric into the knees. Fingers hesitate above the knot of a belt that has been tied the same way for years. There is no surge. No hunger. Only the quiet resistance of a body that would rather remain still, and the faint irritation of knowing that it will not be asked again. Most people believe discipline begins with desire. They wait for the internal signal, the spark, the moment when effort feels justified. That waiting is the first fracture. You see it in the way mornings stretch longer than planned, in the way tools stay untouched while excuses are rehearsed. The body feels heavy, the eyes dry, and the phone lights up with someone else's approval. Nothing happens, and everyone understands why. Warriors and monks never built their lives on wanting. They noticed how desire shifts with sleep, weather, praise, and boredom. So they removed it. Training began when the bell rang, even if the stomach was tight and the shoulders stiff. The sword was lifted the same way on days of clarity and days of fog. Others watched and felt uneasy, unsure why someone would move without visible enthusiasm. There is a kind of discipline that feels almost impersonal. The body stands up before the mind has negotiated. The hands begin before permission is granted. It looks dull from the outside. It is not. Before you continue, name the work you keep postponing because you do not feel like it. Write it in one sentence. No explanation. The morning does not negotiate. He wakes before the alarm finishes its first breath. The room is dim. Cold air settles in the lungs and stays there. For a moment, the body remains still, heavy eyelids pressed shut, pulse slow. The thought arrives quietly, not today. It always does. The ceiling offers no reply, and that silence decides the matter. Feet touch the floor. The chill climbs the calves. Knees complain as they straighten. In the kitchen, someone else is still asleep, and the restraint of not waking them adds weight to each movement. The kettle clicks on without ceremony. There is no ritual for mood. Only sequence. Only order. The body moves because yesterday it moved, and the day before that. Desire would complicate this. Desire would ask for justification. Instead, the belt is tied with stiff fingers, the same loop, the same pull. The mirror shows a face without urgency. Outside, a neighbor loads a car, pauses, watches. He offers a half-smile that carries a question he does not ask. Why now? Why always? The door closes before an answer is required. At the training space, the floor is cold enough to register through fabric. Knees fold down. Shoulders settle. Breath counts return slowly, uneven at first, then steady. The mind drifts toward comfort, toward permission to delay. The body does not follow. Hands repeat the motion they have repeated for years. Each movement is slightly dull. Slightly imperfect. Still, it happens. Others arrive later, louder. They stretch, joke, shake off sleep with exaggerated motion. Someone remarks on the quiet consistency, calls it discipline with a laugh that lands too lightly. It is easier to believe this is enthusiasm, or obsession, or something excessive. It is uncomfortable to consider that it might be simpler than that. There are days when the muscles feel cooperative, when the breath opens easily. Those days are irrelevant. There are days when everything resists, when the dull ache in the legs refuses to fade. Those days are also irrelevant. The work does not change its shape to match internal weather. It remains unchanged, and in that sameness, something else begins to settle. Over time, the question of wanting stops appearing. Not because it was answered, but because it was ignored often enough to weaken. What remains is a narrow path worn into the body itself. Step here. Then here. No ceremony. No reward. Just continuation, and the quiet pressure of knowing that if this breaks, it breaks everywhere, when wanting becomes a liability. The first resistance is never loud. It settles in the chest like stale air. The shoulders tighten as the hands reach for familiar tools. There is no refusal yet, only a quiet delay. The body notices it before the mind names it. A pause that does not belong. Desire would like to be consulted here. It offers small arguments. You trained hard yesterday. The night was short. No one would notice if today slipped. The breath grows shallow as the inner dialogue stretches, and with each extra second, the work feels heavier. Not because it is difficult, but because it is being debated. Across the room, someone else is already moving. Their motions are unremarkable. No intensity. No visible drive. Just repetition. The sound of contact is steady. That steadiness creates friction. It exposes the hesitation in your own hands. You feel it in the jaw, clenched without realizing, and in the heat behind the eyes that comes from holding back motion. Desire is unstable. It swells when praised and collapses when ignored. It sharpens when things feel new and dulls when they repeat. To depend on it is to tie action to mood, and mood shifts faster than skill ever could. Warriors learned this early. Monks learned it in silence. They watched how wanting made training fragile, how it demanded conditions before obedience. So they treated desire the way they treated weather. Not as an enemy, but as something irrelevant. Rain did not cancel practice. Fatigue did not reschedule it. Wanting was allowed to exist, but it was never given authority. The body moved anyway, stiff at first, then warmer, then indifferent. You can see the result in small details. Calloused hands that reach automatically. Knees that fold to the floor without ceremony. Breath that steadies not because it feels good, but because it has been counted so many times before. Others mistake this for obsession. They comment on it, half mocking, half curious. Their tone reveals discomfort. If this does not require desire, what excuse remains? The most dangerous days are not the hardest ones. They are the empty ones. Days when nothing hurts, when nothing excites, when the work feels flat. Desire offers nothing then. It goes silent. Those who rely on it drift. Those who removed it continue, almost bored, almost mechanical. That is when the shift begins. Not dramatic. Not announced. The work starts happening without inner commentary. The body responds to time and place instead of mood. Wanting loses its leverage, and in that loss, something firmer takes its place. A pattern that does not ask permission, and does not forgive interruption. Negotiation is where discipline dies. The moment always feels harmless. The body is already dressed. The tools are nearby. Only a small adjustment is proposed. 10 minutes later. After one more message. After the stiffness fades. The shoulders relax as the thought forms, and that relaxation feels like relief. It is not. Negotiation has a physical signature. The jaw tightens. The breath lifts higher into the chest. Weight shifts from foot to foot without committing forward. The body senses delay as a kind of danger, even when the mind dresses it up as reason. Somewhere nearby, others move on schedule, and their indifference sharpens the discomfort. This is where most routines collapse. Not in refusal, but in discussion. The internal voice multiplies options, each one sounding considerate, balanced, humane. Skip today, return stronger tomorrow. Adjust the plan. Be flexible. Flexibility sounds mature when spoken aloud. Inside, it erodes sequence. Warriors understood that choice is expensive. Every decision drains something subtle. By the time the body is asked to act, the energy meant for action has already been spent arguing. So they narrowed the path. When the hour arrives, movement begins. When it rains, training moves indoors. When fatigue appears, intensity drops, but presence remains. No meeting is held. You can see this difference in posture. The negotiator leans back slightly, chest open, eyes scanning for alternatives. The committed one leans forward, weight settled, gaze lowered to the task itself. One posture invites interruption. The other discourages it. People notice, even if they cannot name why. There is social pressure here. Friends suggest rest. Colleagues joke about rigidity. Someone asks if you ever take days off, their tone halfway between concern and disbelief. The body registers this as heat behind the ears, a tightening across the upper back. To negotiate now would feel polite. To proceed feels impolite. Discipline often does. The work continues anyway. Motions are slower today. The dull ache in the legs does not resolve. Breath remains rough longer than usual. None of this changes the sequence. The hands still return to the same starting point. The count still reaches its end. From the outside, it looks stubborn. From the inside, it feels narrow, almost peaceful. Over time, the negotiations shorten. Not because they are answered, but because they are ignored quickly enough to wither. The body learns that discussion is unnecessary. Time and place become the only signals required. When they appear, action follows. This is the threshold most people never cross. They keep their discipline conditional, adjustable, polite. On the other side, something less flexible waits. A routine that no longer needs your agreement, and will quietly expose every place you still want one. The body learns faster than the mind. At first, the body resists like an animal led against its habit. Muscles stiffen. The lower back tightens when bending down. Breath feels shallow, caught high in the chest. Each repetition feels announced, as if it needs justification. The mind watches closely, waiting for a signal to stop. That signal never comes. Days pass without ceremony. The same hour. The same space. The same sequence. Hands wrap the handle the same way. Knees lower to the floor without pause. The cold registers, then fades. Not because the body enjoys it, but because it recognizes it. Familiarity replaces consent. Something subtle shifts. The alarm sounds and the body turns before thought forms. Feet find the floor while the mind is still heavy with sleep. There is a brief flicker of irritation at this betrayal, then nothing. The belt is already tied. The door is already open. Outside, the air is sharp, and the lungs adapt without complaint. Others notice changes before you do. They comment on predictability. On how you are always there. Always on time. Their jokes carry an edge now. Consistency makes people nervous. It removes shared excuses. When you show up without enthusiasm or complaint, it forces comparison. You feel that pressure in the tightening of your shoulders when they speak. The work itself begins to feel quieter. Movements require less attention. Breath falls into rhythm sooner. The dull ache appears, but it no longer asks questions. It is simply noted and passed through. Desire still visits sometimes, especially on easy days, but it arrives late. After the body is already in motion. This is where many misunderstand what is happening. They think discipline has become easier. It has not. It has become less personal. The work no longer revolves around how it feels to do it. It exists as a fixed point in the day, like gravity. You move in relation to it, not the other way around. There is danger here, too. Complacency hides inside familiarity. Movements can become sloppy. Attention can drift. The body may continue while the mind goes elsewhere. That drift shows up in small errors, in uneven breath, in a momentary loss of balance. The work corrects it immediately, without comment. By now, skipping would feel strange. Not dramatic. Just wrong, like stepping out of rhythm mid-stride. The body would notice the absence before the mind justified it. That awareness is quiet but unforgiving. This is the line. Before it, discipline is an effort you apply. After it, discipline is a state you interrupt at your own cost. And interruptions, once noticed, are hard to ignore. Continuity matters more than intensity. Injury arrives without drama. A sharp pull behind the knee. A dull ache that does not fade after warming up. The body registers it immediately, a clear signal, not a complaint. Movement slows. The range shortens. Breath becomes cautious. None of this cancels the session. This is where intensity would betray you. Pushing through would feel heroic. Stopping entirely would feel reasonable. Both are interruptions. Instead, the work narrows. Fewer repetitions. Smaller motions. The floor is still cold when the knees touch it. The sequence still begins at the same time. The body remains inside the pattern, even if the pattern thins. Others notice the change. Someone suggests rest, their voice careful, watching your reaction. Another jokes about stubbornness. You feel it in the tightness across the upper back, in the brief heat under the skin. Explaining would be easy. Explaining would also be unnecessary. You continue, slower now, deliberate, leaving before fatigue compounds. This is how continuity survives. Not by pretending weakness does not exist, but by refusing to let weakness decide. The monk with fever still sits, briefly. The writer still writes one sentence. The warrior practices footwork instead of strikes. The chain remains unbroken, and that matters more than how strong the links feel today. Perfection demands conditions. Continuity ignores them. It does not ask for ideal circumstances. It only requires that the next step follows the last one without a gap. Gaps are seductive. They promise recovery, clarity, a fresh start. In reality, they reset negotiation. The body forgets. The mind regains leverage. You feel this truth on days when time fractures. A meeting runs late. Plans shift. Fatigue settles into the shoulders. The easy choice would be to declare the day lost. Instead, you shorten the work again. 5 minutes. One sequence. One measured repetition. The body responds with irritation, then compliance. There is no satisfaction in this. No sense of accomplishment. That absence is the point. When the work stops rewarding you, it reveals what remains. If you continue anyway, something durable is forming. If you stop, you will need to rebuild from desire again. Over time, the body trusts continuity. It stops bracing for abandonment. The ache fades faster. Balance returns sooner. Breath steadies even on compromised days. From the outside, this looks modest. Inside, it feels strict. This discipline does not shine. It endures. It does not rise on good days or collapse on bad ones. It holds a narrow line through both, quietly insisting that today connects to yesterday, whether you feel like it or not, when responses are decided in advance. The interruption arrives as expected. Rain against the window. A message that shifts the schedule. A late night that leaves the eyes dry and heavy. None of this is surprising anymore. The surprise would be if the body waited for instruction. The shoes are already placed by the door. Hands reach for them without pause. The floor is cold. The body registers it, then moves through it. There is no question of whether conditions are acceptable. That question was answered long ago, and answering it again would only reopen the door that has been sealed. This is what pre-decision looks like. Not rigidity, but relief. When rain falls, training moves inside. When exhaustion appears, pace drops. When time compresses, the session shortens. These responses are not clever. They are boring. They work because they remove the need to think while pressure is present. Others struggle here. You can see it when plans change. Their faces tighten. Their voices lift slightly as they reassess. Options bloom and collide. You feel the contrast in your own body as you continue forward, pulse steadying while theirs accelerates. Someone comments on your calm, mistaking it for confidence. It is neither. It is familiarity. Pre-decided responses protect continuity. They prevent the mind from turning obstacles into debates. Without them, every disruption becomes a fresh negotiation, and negotiations accumulate fatigue. With them, disruption is absorbed and redirected without comment. There is social friction in this. People expect flexibility in spirit, not just in method. When you adapt without emotional display, it unsettles them. They may accuse you of being inflexible, or worse, detached. You feel the sting of that in the chest, a brief contraction. You let it pass. The work continues. Inside the practice, this shows up as steadiness under uneven conditions. The surface is different. The space is tighter. The breath is shorter. None of this stops the sequence. It alters it. The body adjusts automatically, like water finding a channel. Attention sharpens because it has fewer choices to manage. This is not freedom. It is constraint chosen carefully and kept intact. Freedom, as most understand it, invites endless revision. Constraint closes the loop. It tells the body what will happen next, even when the environment shifts. Over time, this reliability becomes internal. Stress no longer scrambles you as easily. When something breaks, the next step appears without panic. Others sense this and lean on it, sometimes too heavily. They assume you will adapt, that you will carry on. You feel the weight of that expectation in the shoulders. The danger now is subtle. If responses are not reviewed occasionally, they can harden past usefulness. Discipline demands maintenance, not reinvention. The line between preparedness and stagnation is thin, and crossing it happens quietly. Still, without pre-decided responses, discipline never survives contact with reality. With them, it becomes something that can absorb impact without losing its shape, when identity quietly replaces effort. The change is not announced. There is no moment you would point to later and call a turning point. It shows up indirectly, in the absence of certain sensations. The tightness before starting is gone. The internal commentary has thinned. The body moves into position with the neutrality of habit. You notice it one morning when someone interrupts you mid-preparation. A question. A request. Your hands pause, but the sequence does not dissolve. When the interruption passes, the hands resume without resentment. The breath refines its count. There is no feeling of having been derailed. Only delayed. This is different from discipline as effort. Effort requires constant reaffirmation. It needs reminders of purpose, of benefit, of identity. What is happening now does not ask for that. The work has slipped below the level of persuasion. It is closer to posture than intention. Others respond differently now. They stop commenting as much. Jokes fade. Invitations adjust themselves around your known schedule. Some people feel relief in that predictability. Others feel quietly excluded by it. You sense both reactions in the body, a loosening in the chest with one, a slight constriction with the other. Neither alters the work. Desire still appears occasionally, but it feels ornamental. On good days, it adds color. On bad days, its absence no longer threatens collapse. The work happens with or without it. That indifference is not coldness. It is stability. There is also a cost. Identity-based discipline leaves little room for indulgent exceptions. Skipping now would not feel like rest. It would feel like a fracture. The body would register it immediately, a low-level irritation, a sense of imbalance that lingers. This awareness keeps you aligned, but it also narrows options. You see this cost mirrored in others. They admire consistency until it reflects their own inconsistency too clearly. Compliments become quieter. Distance appears where camaraderie once was. You feel that distance in the subtle cooling of conversations, in the way silence stretches longer than before. Discipline rearranges social terrain whether you intend it or not. Inside the practice, the work continues to refine itself. Movements grow simpler. Errors stand out sharply. There is less tolerance for sloppiness, not from judgment, but from sensitivity. The body knows when something is off, and corrects it without emotion. This is what it means to do the work without desire. Not suppression. Not denial. Replacement. Desire is no longer the engine. Identity is. The work happens because this is what happens at this hour, in this body, in this life. And once that takes hold, the real question is no longer how to continue, but what happens if you ever decide to stop. Discipline is not something you summon each morning. It is something that remains when summoning is no longer required. At some point, the body understands before the mind does. The hour arrives. The space is entered. The sequence begins. There is no internal rally, no emotional preparation. Just movement. Breath. Contact. The work unfolds the way gravity does not ask permission to pull. This is where many misunderstand what they are seeing. They assume strength. They assume control. What they are witnessing is simpler and harder to escape. Identity has replaced effort. The work is no longer an activity you perform. It is a condition you maintain. The unshakable person is not the one who feels nothing. It is the one who no longer negotiates. Not because negotiation was defeated, but because it was starved of relevance. Desire may still visit. Fatigue still arrives. Doubt still speaks. None of them hold the keys anymore. There is a cost to this. Comfort thins. Social ease shifts. You become predictable in ways that unsettle others. You feel that friction in quiet moments, in the subtle distance that forms when excuses are no longer shared. Discipline always extracts payment. It never asks whether you agree to the price. But there is also clarity. When the work is no longer up for debate, energy returns to execution. The body moves cleanly. Attention sharpens. Days connect instead of resetting. Life stops feeling like a series of restarts. If this resonates, make it public. Comment your commitment in one sentence. No explanation. No context. Just the action you will no longer negotiate.